COP26 President Alok Sharma has urged nations to back a series of texts as the summit's agreement. Sharma said he still intended to close the two-week conference. Negotiators were moving between delegations at the conference, trying to close a deal that would avoid the worst effects of global warming. So the final deal will require the unanimous consent of the almost 200 countries present. They range from coal and gas-fueled superpowers to oil producers and Pacific islands being swallowed by the rise in sea levels. The meeting's main aim is to keep within reach the 2015 Paris Agreement's target to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But national pledges made so far to limit greenhouse emissions would only cap the average global temperature rise at 2.4 Celsius. While that gap will not be closed in Glasgow, Sharma said he hoped the final deal would pave the way for deeper cuts. All right, for more on this, joining me now is Achim Steiner, who's administrator of the UN Development Programme. Sir, a very good evening to you. I guess it's afternoon there. Thank you very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Good afternoon, Griselda. It is indeed. Very good to be with you.
Thank you very much. So you've just returned to New York from COP26. We get mixed reactions, to this landmark climate conference. So if 1.5 degrees in Earth's temperature rise is the goal, was this event a success or failure in your view?
Well, the worst case scenario could have been no outcome, and that probably would have been the end, let's say, of a realistic scenario of staying within a 1.5 degree, at least, opportunity that we still have. I think many delegates, as we speak right now, in fact, the conference is in its most critical stage down to the wire. There is, I think, a sense that the window of opportunity of still aiming for a 1.5 degree world will still be available to us to act on after Glasgow. So I think, as of now, the agreement is not yet signed, not yet reached. This is still a very intense moment, but I think many can recognize that there is growing momentum. And above all, Glasgow was always about bringing the world together after Paris, 5 years after Paris, with a higher level of ambition. And I think we have seen that from many countries.
Yeah, so the call has been clear now for quite a while, end the use of fossil fuels like coal, end the fossil fuel subsidies, and wealthy nations should help poor countries fund that transition under a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So what's your assessment of that relationship between those who are in the main created this crisis and those who say, show me the money?
Well, indeed, we have a historical legacy, and then we have the challenge of the future. And as you know, in the atmosphere, emissions accumulate irrespective of where they originate from. And so I think the challenge has always been since 1995, when the first conference of the parties met, is to find a way in which one can work together, taking into account common but differentiated responsibilities and realities. Take South Africa. Its dependence historically on coal clearly puts it in a very different place than a country such as Denmark, for example. And that has been the challenge all along. How do we make a transition that allows us collectively, as a global economy, as societies across the world, to decarbonize our economies, but recognize that we need to help one another? And this is, I think, where also the deal that South Africa negotiated with a number of countries is perhaps emblematic of where we need to go with this, namely to co-invest in this effort.
Yeah, we'll talk about that very shortly. Secretary General Guterres just saying on Thursday, that governments need to pick up the pace. And I quote, he said, we cannot settle for the lowest common denominator. We know what must be done. Keeping the 1.5 goal within reach means reducing emissions globally by 45% by 2030. And yet, it appears that the national determined contributions, even if it's fully implemented, will still increase emissions by 2030. What's your assessment of where we find ourselves at the end of this two-week-long meeting in Glasgow?
Well, in many ways, I think collectively speaking, the world is really with its back against the wall right now. We have run out of time. We have lost too much time. And in that sense, the 1.5 degree objective remains increasingly at risk. And I think what the Secretary General was pointing to is this urgency that is needed. Now, there is also some good news, because in only 5 years, we have moved from where we were just before Paris, a scenario of 3.5 degree global warming, almost maybe 2.6, 2.5. So there is progress. But what the Secretary General has appealed yet again to the world is the pace is too slow. So out of Glasgow, we needed to have momentum, and I think some will leave Glasgow perhaps disappointed, but let us also recognize the Paris Agreement is working. Yeah. Over 3/4 of nations have submitted their national climate strategies. Most of them have raised ambition levels, but not yet enough.
I see you also met with South Africa's Environment Minister, Barbara Creecy, at COP after the country, of course, had refused to sign a pledge to move away from coal, basically arguing that this is needed to be done in terms of the negotiations through the convention. So add to that fact, the Energy Minister here in South Africa, Gwede Mantashe, this week at a conference here in Cape Town called for African solidarity and a unified front in basically resisting global pressure to rapidly ban fossil fuels, going as to say African countries were being converted into conduits of ideas of developed economies. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think one, first of all, has to recognize that in these international negotiations, there are very different realities that each country brings to them. So I have great sympathy for South Africans who say, look, how are we actually going to solve our transition to a low-carbon economy? Yeah. I think anybody who looks at the future today, Griselda, has to acknowledge that the future is going to be low carbon. The decarbonization pathway is essentially where the world is heading. Yeah. And therefore, for South Africa, the question is, how can one accelerate that transition, a just transition? How can one get the developed world to co-invest, but also what kind of policies, what kind of investments and priorities would South Africa set for itself? And I think it is here that also with your minister, I discussed this essential part of a just transition also at the local level. Where a power station is in a town, there's a whole community, there's a local economy. Yeah. All of us need to figure out ways in which we can make this transition not happen at the expense of people. But I would still argue that South Africa has a long history with coal. Mm. Now, the question is its coal really the foundation for its energy of the future? Or is it going to be a more competitive economy if it can move out of coal over time and with just transition and with investments also from the richer world? And in that sense, South Africa, quite rightly, plays a significant role in the Group of 77 in China during these negotiations.
On the other hand, Mary Robinson, the chair of the Elders, also this week called out countries like China, Russia, Brazil, Australia and Saudi Arabia as amongst countries that could do more. And yet, we again saw efforts to water down the consensus-driven approach to any deal struck at COP. Is a consensus amongst member states problematic given the climate catastrophe that looms?
In terms of the science, it has been problematic for years because we have known what we needed to be doing. And yet, it's not only the science that defines that. It is our economies, our societies, our different energy systems. And I think people often underestimate that over the last 26 Conference of the Parties, what we have achieved is to first of all agree on a global climate effort that needs to be undertaken. And now we're negotiating very specific elements, including co-financing, including adaptation finance, including loss and damage. These are difficult discussions, and yet we are making progress, albeit too slow. To those who always criticize the Conference of the Parties, I would say, what is your alternative? Each country for itself certainly would take us nowhere closer to where we need to be. And secondly, I think sometimes we also have to remember every country in that hall also sits in a glass house. No country has really delivered on all its commitments and promises. Yeah. What these conferences, however, do is allow your citizens across the world to see what our country is doing, which ones are moving forward, which ones are holding the process back, and above all, to understand how we help one another to move forward faster together.
Yeah, and something that must have pleased you as well, given the fraught relationship between China and the United States. You must have been quite pleased to see them reach agreement to cut emissions faster over the next decade. What is their joint responsibility in all of this?
Well, the simplest way of summarizing is it's 43% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions that these two countries represent. So in one fell swoop, we have seen at least a symbolic gesture where these two countries, as so often in recent years, are at cross purposes with one another, geopolitically speaking, sending a very important signal. And it is, the largest developed economy, and it is also the largest developing economy that here in Glasgow, I think, sent an important message that despite all the differences and the different pathways that also need to be followed, they are going to work together. And that is really where we need to be. This is not Europe versus Africa, Africa versus Asia. This is really a world community that needs to change the parameters within which energy transitions can happen. And as you can imagine, as head of the UN Development Programme, this is a particular focus of ours also in Africa, where we are working ever faster on helping countries, first of all, to give access to electricity and energy to their citizens. Let's remember, almost 500 million African citizens don't have access yet.
And just finally, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and others pointing out that while we have yet to fully financially capacitate the Green Climate Fund, that the $100 billion is simply not going to be enough for a just transition, mitigation and adaptation. I'm hearing that developing nations are now calling for at least $750 billion a year. So given that you sit in the finance group of the G20, what do you make of that number?
Well, I think any number right now, especially in the midst of a pandemic and all the economic fallout that we have experienced, can be a challenge to many countries. But the fact is 100 billion is merely the floor. Let us be clear, the kind of energy transitions, economic transformations we need in the coming decade and decades will require hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. Now, the question is, can we mobilize that public finance, north-south finance, but also mobilizing private sector capital? And an important discussion in Glasgow also was, what are the kinds of frameworks that the private markets, financial markets, can also have in order to invest in this transition? Without that capital, it is going to be very difficult. But let's be very clear. Yeah. Public finance, and particularly north-south finance, has to go well beyond the $100 billion. It is a shared interest. It is a co-investment. It is not a donation.
Achim Steiner, Administrator of the UN Development Programme, thank you very much for joining us here on SABC News. Thanks for making time.